I would love to hear from you all on like what you think a student borrower looks like. You know, what do you hear? Who are they? Who's having this debt? And yeah, what does the typical borrower kind of come to mind for you? You can just shout it out.
Most students who are in school right now.
Yeah, okay, great. Most current students. Awesome. Anything else?
Or former students too.
Former students, yeah.
First-gen students.
Yeah, awesome. Any other thoughts?
Kind of like first gen, like young women.
Yeah, awesome.
Student parents.
Yeah, great. Yep. Cool. All right, that's good. That's good to get us started. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a lot of things. We'll go over kind of a general overview of the student debt crisis, a little bit about student debt in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota, and then Jacob's going to come up and talk about some of the federal student loan policy updates, including the ones under the One Big Beautiful Bill that are kind of forthcoming. We'll also talk about some ways that states can act, and as Casey mentioned, Minnesota's already acted in a few ways. There's more that you can do, but certainly like Minnesota has been a leader in this space, which is great. How you can act locally, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers too. How does that sound? Does that sound cool? Okay, great. So you all mentioned what student loan borrowers look like. So let's dive in a little bit to the data and what that looks like. So when we're talking about student loans, we're going to spend most of the day talking about federal student loans. That's the majority of the market. That is loans that are either directly owned by the federal government or loans that were initiated by private lenders and then backed by the federal government. So those direct loans are kind of this, the biggest portion of those loans. And then some of these loans that were, originated by private lenders are like Phelps and Perkins loans up here. But they were backed by the federal government. And so, that whole slice of the pie is kind of what we consider federal loans. And then we've got a smaller chunk of the pie, which is private loans, but certainly a growing market and a very opaque market. And so Jacob will kind of walk through what some of those changes might mean for the private student loan market upcoming. And I guess I just want to acknowledge too that like we could talk about this for hours. There's like so much data and research out there, but we'll move pretty quickly through this stuff so that we can get to the federal updates, which I feel like is so timely right now. It is now the right behind mortgages, and so folks have debt for mortgages, but then the second leading thing above credit cards and auto loans is student loans, and so that's $1.7 trillion. In addition, folks are taking on more debt. More folks are taking on more debt, but then also those balances are growing. So now, almost 1 in 5 or more than 1 in 5 now owe more than $50,000. And so, we're seeing folks take out more student debt to meet the rising cost of education. Also, parents taking on student debt for their children, in addition to having their own debt still. And so, those balances are growing by person as well. I know a lot of some folks here mentioned, you think of like students or young people having student debt, but a lot of student debt borrowers are older. They're like approaching retirement, they're in retirement, they're having their Social Security checks garnished, and so now almost 2/3 of borrowers are over 30 years old. But the number of stories that we hear from folks that are delaying retirement or thinking about like whether or not they can actually do that is growing. And so that's definitely a growing market. This is sort of like self-explanatory, I think, but if you're making payments on your student loans every month, you have less money to put away in a savings account, and so you then have less wealth accumulation by 7 times. And so this has rippling effects across the economy that are being felt. This is a really popular one. I think you hear this a lot in the news that folks aren't able to own homes or are delaying home ownership in order to pay off their student loans. That's a very common one, I think. We also talk about the student debt crisis as a civil rights crisis. The demographic that holds the most student debt is Black women, and not only are they carrying more student debt, but they have a harder time in repayment because of all the inequities that already exist in our society. And so after 20 years, the average Black borrower still owes 95% of their student loans, while their white counterparts have paid off 95% of their original balance. And so just like this has implications that are quite large over long periods of time. and I'm sure you know that if you're also in repayment right now, like, how long have you had your student loans and are having trouble making ends meet? So a little bit about debt in the Twin Cities and Minnesota. Okay, so the total amount of debt in the Twin Cities is around $23 billion, and it's $27 billion in the state. So the Twin Cities actually holds, most of the student debt in the state, and that's true for the number of borrowers as well. I mentioned folks, approaching retirement or in retirement having student debt. So that's almost 10%, right, of adults in the Twin Cities have, between the ages of 55 and 84 having student debt, and around 8% for those in Minnesota. The average student debt is actually very close to the national average. It usually hovers around $36,000, and it's a little bit lower than the national average in Minnesota itself. So Jacob is also going to talk about defaults and delinquencies a little bit, but I just wanted to share some numbers here based on 2025 data and then also 2020 data. So, the number of folks that are severely delinquent right now is around 8%, both in the Twin Cities and Minnesota. It's less than the national average, so you all are doing a little bit better than the national average, but that's kind of where the numbers are right now in this moment of time. But of course, we've had the payment pause, so folks weren't, required to make payments for 3.5 years during the pandemic. And then there was an on-ramp period where folks weren't feeling the negative consequences of non-payment, so they weren't being reported to credit bureaus. And so we think that this number will climb back up to this kind of pre-2020, pre-pandemic number here. So maybe closer to 10% or a little bit higher. Jacob will talk more about this, but that's what it looks like here in Minnesota. And then just another note on delinquency. So when you look at neighborhoods that are lower to middle income neighborhoods versus middle and upper income neighborhoods, the folks that are severely delinquent also varies, right? There's like 5% or so difference between those two. And the same is for Minnesota and nationally. I think that this is, sort of obvious, but if you have a subprime credit score, 30% of those people with subprime credit scores are severely delinquent on their student loans, right? It's really affecting other areas of their life. Maybe they're not able to get a car or a house because of their credit score. And then this is also on your fact sheets, but when you, again, compare kind of neighborhoods, by demographics, so in majority black neighborhoods, 20% of the Twin Cities of those neighborhoods are severely delinquent, as opposed to just 8% in majority white or non-Hispanic neighborhoods. So I think, in short, like Minnesota and the Twin Cities are very similar across cities across the United States, and really in line with what we're seeing at the national level. Okay, I think that's a little bit from me, but I think I'll have Jacob come up and talk a little bit about federal student loan policy updates. And maybe wave, a little wave for Jacob.
Thanks so much, Amy. My name's Jacob, and a little bit about me. I'm a fellow with Protect Borrowers. I was previously worked for a little over a decade for City and County of San Francisco in their Office of Financial Empowerment, so working on student loan debt and other economic justice issues. That thread continues in what I do with Protect Borrowers, which is continuing to work with cities and the city's close-end partners, which includes a lot of nonprofits, higher ed institutions, community leaders, et cetera, to empower them on this issue. And I'm going to first start off with a kind of a continuation of what Amy was talking about. I think it was important to note that some of the data for Twin Cities in Minnesota was pulled from credit panel data from the first quarter of 2025, so like March of this year. And that's not that long ago, but it's importantly long ago enough that when you look at the curve of these numbers on delinquency and default, et cetera, they're so steep that things have been changing a lot in the intervening months. So first of all, what is delinquency? You could consider yourself to be delinquent on a student loan after you miss the date of actual payment. But what we actually call severe delinquency is when when servicers who own these loans start to report them to credit bureaus, and that happens after 3 months. And so we've already seen a huge impact of borrowers moving from prime to subprime, of borrowers seeing significant drops in their credit scores. And that means it's harder to rent, it's harder to get a job, it's harder to buy a car or a house. It has a real ripple impact on you. Default happens much later. Default is after 270 days or 9 months. Sometimes it takes closer to a year to officially kind of fall into student loan default. And with default comes not only continuing reporting that you are in default status to credit bureaus and that ding on your credit score, but some pretty severe collections activity, some pretty severe debt collection from the federal government. So as you can see here, first of all, we've had 5.3 million people in default. That group of folks of 5.3 million have been in default since pre-pandemic. These are like long-term defaulters. And there's many folks who have a lot of trouble getting out of default or who cycle back in. The projection, and we'll get to the numbers that are projected soon, is that that number could be as many as 10 million by the end of the year. And I started to get to debt collections. We are very concerned in the here and now that as people are moving towards tax season, and some of you here may be working with VITA or other free tax prep coalitions and being concerned about helping people. If you are in student loan default, the government can seize all of your tax refund. And they only have to tell you one time. So if you fall into default now, you would get one notice explaining what it is and maybe what you can do about it. They could take your taxes next year, they could take your refund the year after that, they could take your refund the year after that, and they don't have to tell you. They'll just do the one notice. Wage garnishment is not here yet, but it could come at any time. It's really a matter of the government setting up contracting with third-party debt collectors to enable that to happen. Not on this list right now is Social Security seizure, taking people's Social Security payments, which is horrible. Secretary of Education has said we're not going to do that right now, so it's not happening now. But there's no law that they have that power, and so we just have the Secretary's word, essentially, that they're not going to take Social Security payments. There are things people can do. To get out of default, you can rehabilitate or consolidate. And when you're in collections, there are a number of defenses you can raise to say, I have financial hardship or I have other problems making these payments that can at least reduce the amount of money that is being collected, if not halt those collections activities. But you have to know that you have those rights, and you probably need to get some help. And we'll get into how to help kind of borrowers in a bit. So it talked about at nearly 10 million people potentially in default by the end of the year. Here's a snapshot. We saw Q1 2025. Here's a snapshot at the end of September. This leaves out that 5+ million who are in default. We talked about them already. And it leaves out some number of students who are enrolled in school and so aren't repaying. But of the remainder, 35 million borrowers, only about a third of them are actually making current payments. That's a lot of folks just not having any connection to the repayment system. A little over 10 million are in forbearance. We'll talk about where the bulk of those folks are coming from in a bit. And then almost 7 million are at least 30 days delinquent. You could add the 5.3 we know are in default already to that, so it's actually a higher number, but just the folks who haven't reached default yet. And look at this number in particular. Almost 4.5 million borrowers are somewhere between 6 and 9 months late, which means that the next time we see these numbers come out, that's where we're getting this huge spike in default. So we talked about those who are in forbearance. A big chunk of them are in forbearance because they enrolled in the SAVE plan. The SAVE plan was created under the Biden administration to be the most affordable of the income-driven plans that tie your repayment to your household income and your household size. But unfortunately, as I think most of us know, it was halted when a number of right-wing AGs sued. And so ever since that time, for some couple of years now anyway, these borrowers have been in an administrative forbearance. So more than 7 million borrowers now are in this forbearance. They don't have to make payments, but they don't get any credit towards loan forgiveness under IDR or public service loan forgiveness. And in August, interest started to accrue. So the overall loan size is going to be growing. The good news is some small group of borrowers did get their debt canceled through SAVE, so kind of an early implementation of some of the SAVE terms allowed people to get debt canceled. They're not going to reinstate that debt. Those people will preserve that. A little bit more good news, because there's a lot of bad news in these slides, there's no doubt. So at some point earlier, at the beginning of the Trump administration, the Department of Ed, decided that through some convoluted reading of the SAVE lawsuits that were happening, we're not allowed to take any more, process any more applications for certain IDR plans. At some points it was all IDR plans, and we're not allowed to process loan forgiveness for people who have repaid for 20 or 25 years and met their income-driven repayment forgiveness terms. So American Federation of Teachers, AFT, sued the administration, Protect Borrowers, and another small law firm were part of support on that lawsuit, which is ongoing. But the good news is that recently, on the 17th of last month, we got what will take the form of a court order holding them to essentially say, we have to follow the law. And by following the law, they said, we do have to cancel debt for eligible borrowers and these are all income-driven repayment plans. IDR, ICR, PAY, PSLF. We can come back with more questions about if you're not understanding or if there's just a term you don't get, please raise your hand. So they said, okay, as we're supposed to by the law, we will cancel that debt. And importantly, the date that that debt is canceled is when you first became eligible. So if you're stuck, and many people are right now in this huge backlog of applications that haven't been processed yet, your debt might actually not get fully canceled until sometime next year, even if it was supposed to happen in this fall. That's important because next year, that debt that is forgiven is going to be taxable income. And that's a huge hit for folks. And so by saying when you became eligible for the cancellation, that is when we're going to honor that, means they should not be sending out tax forms and tax bills to people for this year based on debt forgiveness. And they also agreed to, I'll make sure they also agreed to give refunds if you made payments after you should have gotten your debt forgiven, and to process all the applications, including what's called PSLF buybacks. This is essentially very applicable for people who are sitting in this SAVE administrative forbearance and not making payments. This program offers people an opportunity to buy back, to pay for months that they have not made payment, and then get that credit. So if you're, for example, looking to get public service loan forgiveness, or if you've been repaying a long time under an IDR plan, it may make sense to you to say, ooh, if I can just catch up these 6 to 12 months, I can be there. And that's what that program is for. And so they're going to need to start processing those. And there will be monthly reports on this to keep their feet to the fire. In another lawsuit, in another issue, so public service loan forgiveness I've talked about a couple of times. Essentially, it just says if you work for a nonprofit, for a 501c3, or for any level of government, local, state, county, tribal, et cetera, then if you make 120 payments, 10 years worth of payments, you will have the remaining debt forgiven. The rules were always very clear on this. If that employer that you work for meets one of those, then you get that debt forgiven. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now the administration has come in and recently published a new rule saying, well, if that employer that you work for engages in what we are labeling substantially illegal activities of a substantially illegal purpose, then we can say you're no longer eligible to be a public service loan forgiveness employer, meaning all of your employees are no longer eligible to get public service loan forgiveness. What does that mean, substantial illegal purpose? Largely it means things that the Trump administration just simply does not agree with. So immigration work, including sanctuary, sort of so-called sanctuary city efforts, anything DEI, gender-affirming care, preserving the right to protest, have all been specifically pretty much called out as reasons to strip PSLF eligibility. So it's cruel. It's clearly a way to weaponize the program. It's meant to be able to target cities like the Twin Cities, cities like all the places where we're seeing ICE today. And so we sued. We sued them and said, there's no way, there's a million reasons that this is illegal. And so fingers crossed that we get a good resolution there. So now we get to the one big, beautiful, brutal, awful bill, OBBBA. It made some really important changes to how we finance higher education that will come into play over the next few years. Some of those changes are, there will be new limits on how much you can borrow, and the Grad Plus program is going to be eliminated. So Amy talked about implications for the private loan market. There's one right off the bat. As you see new limits on federal loan borrowing, if people have that gap between what they can borrow from the federal government and what they need to pay, they're going to need to go somewhere to borrow, and that brings private loans into play. There will also be an elimination of unemployment or economic hardship deferments for new loans taken out after July of 2027. And at the core of it is that new borrowers after next July will no longer have the range of income-driven repayment plans available to them, and even the standard repayment plan will change. So there will be a new standard plan and a new what they're calling repayment assistance plan, or RAP, and we'll show you what those look like. So if you're an existing borrower, what does that mean? You can stay in the plan that you're in. You can stay and save. You can stay in ICR, pay, IBR, but only up until July 1st of 2028, when you must switch to IBR or to the new RAP plan, or you'll be defaulted into the kind of the new standard plan, I think, probably. Parent Plus borrowers are a particular concern here. They will no longer have access to any income-driven repayment. They will have to use the standard plan. Parent Plus has been, originally it was a way for largely whiter, wealthier borrowers who had different sort of liquidity issues to have different ways to borrow to repay for school. Increasingly, it is more for first-generation students and communities of color and lower-income students who really care about getting their kids or their grandkids or whomever in their family through school. And so they pick up the slack by borrowing themselves. And those have always been a little bit problematic then because they just don't get the same rights and treatment. And so we have a lot of concerns that unless they consolidate into a new loan, they're going to be really stuck. And then I mentioned already that debt canceled starting next year is going to be considered taxable income unless we come up with a fix for that. So here's what the new standard plan looks like. Essentially, it does make a fixed repayment term, so you're simply dividing what you owe over a set number of years. The old plan was simply everything was 10 years. Now, depending on how much you borrow, that loan can get stretched out to as many as 25 years, meaning your loans are spread over a longer period, so the payments are smaller, but meaning 25 years, even under a standard plan to repay your loans, is a very long time. And then the repayment assistance plan, the RAP plan, takes a set percentage of your income in the following ways. You can see, depending on how much you make, it takes a certain percentage, between 1 and 10% of your adjusted gross income. There are a couple of positives. This is not a good policy from our perspective, but there are a couple of positives. As you see, you do get to subtract dependent children to a certain extent, $50 per month per dependent child. And also, a really horrible feature of existing loans is that when the payments that you're making aren't enough to repay both your primary capital and the interest that has accrued, then that interest keeps ballooning the amount you pay. So you see plenty of stories, right? I'm sure in this room we have plenty of stories. Borrowed 10, 20, or 30,000, been making payments for a while, I owe way more than I initially borrowed. Some of that feature does go away here because they will subsidize or essentially wipe out any extra interest. Once you make your payment, if there's additional interest that you should have owed, the government will wipe that out. So we talked through some of where these concerns are. These are just probably some of the areas where there are some concerns. Parent Plus borrowers do have to take action. And so that is a message to take back, anyone in your family, in your community. They must not only start, but have their consolidation process completed into a new IDR plan by July 1st of 2026 so that they can access IBR. You can find online exact processes of how you do that. It's a little bit of a kludgy couple of step process. You apply for the income contingent or ICR plan, you make at least one payment, then you consolidate again into IBR, but it's going to be really important to do that. We also mentioned that defaulted borrowers can have their refunds seized. So getting out of default before filing your taxes may be something really important to look at. Of course, any borrower who's considering going back to school, so people with existing debt, if they want to go back to grad school, or if they want to complete their degree, or if they want to go back and borrow again for any reason, or consolidate their loans, and they do that after July of 2026, it means all of their loans end up either in the WRAP plan or the new standard plan. They do not get to retain the current plan that they're on. And then we've got, in general, new borrowers who are going to have, we've had enough trouble keeping the loan servicing system together in our current environment. This is a massive change. It's going to happen fairly quickly, and they're going to have to really remake how everything works for new borrowers. And so we are concerned that that opens the door as well to scams, to predatory actors, et cetera. I should say what's not included here in the previous slides about the one big beautiful bill. It also allows Pell Grants. Pell Grants go to the most low-income families and most low-income students. It allows Pell Grants to now be used for short-term or what they call workforce Pell programs. In some cases, that sounds like and probably is a really good thing. People who are doing a sort of a form of a degree or certificate or workforce training that really allows them to gain skills and have a better job market. But it's only a short-term program and it's not that expensive and you can use Pell dollars. That's great. Unfortunately, this world of short-term workforce training is filled up with a bunch of shady actors too, boot camps and others who promise the world to you, and you end up with a really worthless certificate and degree, and this really opens the floodgates for more borrowing. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to Amy.
And can I just get a show of hands, if you feel comfortable, and only if you feel comfortable, if you work for a nonprofit or a government agency and are seeking public service loan forgiveness currently? Okay, cool, awesome. So just one note, because this question came up earlier in the week, but so the tax piece of this, so for public service loan forgiveness, when you get your debt canceled under that program, it never counts as income on your taxes, and so that's not a thing that you have to worry about, right? You're not going to be hit with a big tax bill if you're seeking PSLF. The folks that we're really worried about on the tax bill side are the ones that are seeking IDR cancellation, and so those programs are 20 to 25 years of being in repayment. You're making payments on your loans, and so that's who we're really worried about with the tax bomb. And then also just a note that some states also tax student debt cancellation. I don't think Minnesota is one of them, but just in case you're talking to some of your friends in another state, some states do count that as income on state taxes. Okay, so how can states take action, and what have you all already done? So Casey mentioned the Borrower Bill of Rights that already exists here in Minnesota. It created a student loan advocate at the state level so that folks have a place to go to, which of course is incredibly important now that there have been so many layoffs at the federal government, and the ombudsman at the Department of Education really doesn't have the time or capacity to kind of take a lot of those cases. So that became incredibly important that you all have a Borrower Bill of Rights here in Minnesota. In addition, it created a licensing structure to have student loan lenders register in the state in the same way that you would register lenders like auto lenders or other things, other companies that do lending in the state. So pretty common sense legislation, but you already have that. So congratulations. You can give yourselves a pat on the back for already having a Bill of Rights. Another thing that states are doing are these private loan registries. So we mentioned that private loans are a growing market and that it's a quite opaque market. So we don't know who owes what to whom and how much that is. And that sometimes looks like student loan companies, private student loan companies, getting default judgments in someone's name that they might not even owe that debt. And so, really important that we better understand this market. And so, it's as simple as a registry that lists the debt and who owes the debt to whom and what companies are operating in that state. Pretty common sense stuff. In addition, I mentioned, this problem with default judgments. And so, if you are being sued by a private student debt company and say you don't show up at your hearing that day, they can get a default judgment in your name even if you don't owe that debt to them. They might have incorrect records, and at this point, they're not required to kind of prove that they owe the debt. And so some states have done debt collection reform around this. And some of the private student loan protections include things like cosigner release. So if you are 17 and you went to school and you took out a private student loan to go to school, you maybe needed a parent or a guardian to cosign that loan. After a certain amount of time of being, making payments on those loans, your cosigner can be released from that agreement. But of course, that doesn't happen all the time for all sorts of reasons. And so, some states have kind of taken action to make it that you absolutely have to get your cosigner released after making a certain number of payments on your student loans. in addition, most people don't think of student loans as something that maybe is held at the institutional level, but we work a lot on institutional debt. So that's debt that's held by institutions of higher education for things like parking fees, or maybe you had a family emergency and you needed to leave school after the withdrawal date at your university, and now you're on the hook for thousands of dollars of tuition. And so, a longstanding practice has been transcript withholding and diploma withholding in those cases. And it's just a longstanding practice that doesn't yield the kind of return on the money that is actually owed. I think one Ohio report, kind of stated that I think they make 17 cents on the dollar for the transcript withholding. So it's not even like a working practice that's getting institutions a lot of money. And it, disproportionately affects low-income and first-generation students. So some states have worked to end transcript withholding and diploma withholding, so that folks can switch schools, go to a different school if you couldn't finish at your own school, or get your diploma so that you can get a job to then pay the debt back. So it really puts people in a double bind. Minnesota has also done work on transcript and diploma withholding as well. So these two are the ones that Minnesota has. In addition, some states have done work around public service loan forgiveness. So that's a federal program. You can't make changes to the program, but some states have made it easier to kind of access the program. I don't know how long you all have been in the public service loan forgiveness for those who raised their hand, but it was created in 2007. By the time the first kind of swath of folks came around in 2017 to get their debt canceled, only 2% of folks were getting public service loan forgiveness. And that was because servicers weren't communicating properly. So I mentioned in the beginning that there's direct loans, and then there's some of these older loans that still exist in the system, like FELP loans. FELP loans aren't eligible for public service loan forgiveness, but you can consolidate your loans, which is like refinancing with the federal government, to make them direct loans and make them eligible for PSLF. But of course, when people were calling their servicers and saying like, hey, I'm interested in PSLF, and they had a FEL loan, the servicer would just say, well, you're not eligible. And so then all these folks, didn't consolidate, were making progress, or they thought they were making progress, but then of course, weren't. So the Biden administration did something called the PSLF waiver. Maybe you're familiar with that. But basically they loosened some of the restrictions so that folks could access PSLF forgiveness through that program. So all to say that, there are a lot of problems with the PSLF program, right? It's not perfect. But some folks aren't aware that they're eligible for PSLF if they work for a nonprofit or a government. And so some of these bills just kind of have a notification method. It's like, if you work for the city or the state or a nonprofit, you're mandated to notify your employees that they're eligible for this program. And in addition, the federal government has said that for adjunct and contingent faculty, they can use a multiplier to multiply their hours, because maybe on paper they only work 10 hours a week instruction in a classroom, but it doesn't include all the time that they're prepping for lessons, grading, all sorts of things. And so the federal government has said you can multiply your hours by 3.35 to get you over that 30 hours a week full-time threshold. And so some states have mandated that multiplier, or even made it higher. I think one state did like 4.35, just to make sure that folks absolutely could get over that threshold. So there's a lot of options of things to do at the state level. And that's not including kind of all these things at the bottom, like litigation and advocacy. We run a lot of sign-on letters, and so when a rulemaking happens at the federal level, we'll often organize sign-on letters. So if that's something of interest to you that your organization might be able to sign on to, it's a show of power. So there's plenty of opportunity at the state level, and then also at the local level, which I'm going to pass over to Jacob again.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you just have organizations sign on to the letters, or do you have individuals do that as well?
Okay, that's a great question. So usually we are the ones running an organizational sign-on letter, but we also have some ones circulating throughout Congress to Congress members. Some of our partner organizations handle a lot of the individual letters. So Student Debt Crisis Center runs them often on their website or through Action Network. So yeah, usually I think other groups are tackling the individual ones, but they certainly exist, and you should absolutely sign on to those too.
And the students, that would be an easy, we want you to have your voice heard, so you can connect to this. So
Totally. That's a great idea. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Take it away.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
Continue our musical chairs here. So I'm talking a little bit now about what localities can do. I've explained I work with local governments, and so often this is a message to local governments, but I want to reiterate again, it's not just local governments, it's all of the myriad of partners. If you've worked in local government or even just live in a city where you see these services happening, you know that it's not literally the city delivering a lot of these services. It's through contracts and partnerships and agreements and grants with a myriad of nonprofits and local community groups. So what I'm talking about here is definitely applicable to sort of the broader community at the local level. Some of the things that we're seeing is up front, there's a big gap in like, where do I get help? Where do I get good information? We haven't solved for that. We haven't really come close to solving for that yet, but we're looking to see how we can chip away at the problem, which has just gotten worse under the current administration because now there's just really nowhere to go with the Department of Education to get some sort of assistance. And so there are a couple of models out there where you can provide training for frontline staff, which includes frequently financial coaches or counselors, but could be someone else who's in a sort of a frontline position. There have been models around the country of a couple of states at least who have state funding that goes to sort of one primary nonprofit to be the backbone for this and maybe create a state level hotline and have grants to lots of local counseling agencies, and then there's somebody who provides training and professional development. So there's a model for that. Or there's just really sort of how can you kind of bootstrap your local programs a little bit better? How can we help you find who's right to help provide some training and assistance there? Obviously funding, really important too. Dan from Lutheran Social Services, we were talking about some student loan counseling and other counseling work that you all do where you don't necessarily get the state funding that you used to get, and now it's, there's potential cost, and that is somewhere where cities can step in or pressure can be applied on the state to say this is something that seems really important for a relatively small amount of dollars. Legal aid plays an important role as well, and so legal aid organizations are the free legal assistance folks in your community, and increasingly there are folks who are really specialized on student loan debt. Even if you do not specialize in student loan debt, there's some help from a just general debt and debt collections perspective that you can get from legal aid. But increasingly these partnerships are really important to maybe expand a local legal aid contract to say, let's do some student debt clinics as well. Let's make sure there's availability of assistance from free legal aid. The data collection and outreach refers in particular to where there are programs that are engaging people around financial well-being and counseling, et cetera, but capturing those stories is really important too, and sort of understanding the scope of the problem and just making sure that you're asking the right questions. This bullet on borrower assistance tools and direct repayment assistance talks about like literally what can you do. So as an entity, whether you're a city or a county or a nonprofit, one thing you can certainly start out by doing, and Amy kind of alluded to it, make sure everyone knows that you can qualify for PSLF and that there's help available to fill out the forms that you need, and that make sure that as close to 100% of folks that have that situation are doing it. You can also pay for certain loan repayment platforms. Companies called Summer or Savvy are the two prominent ones who do this, and offer that as a benefit to your employees. That's basically acknowledging this is really complex stuff. It's hard for people who, frankly, may have stepped away from student debt for years now and just may have not logged in, may not have any knowledge of what they owe and to who and where it's going. And so these tools can be offered, and a couple of cities are doing that. A few different cities and counties also offer a direct repayment benefit that's essentially saying we're going to help you pay down your loans. And then one more tool that I think is pretty cool, it's linked, which doesn't help much in a presentation here, but we can get you these slides. We helped create a congressional casework tool so that if you are really having problems, servicers are not known to be extremely helpful when you're trying to say this doesn't seem right, there's something that's wrong here, I can't get a straight answer. You can use this tool to go directly to your members of Congress, and they have whole constituent teams that have to do this work, and it's a way to kind of elevate and get some response back. I think I talked a little bit about outreach, education, and awareness. I'm not going to go through all of these points necessarily, but in addition to direct assistance, there's the general public assistance. making sure there are websites that are available, making sure you have flyers, making sure people at VITA programs get the right information. Where can we have those touch points where we can help people gain some better awareness and elevate the right voices on this? And staying engaged, and that's what we're doing right here, right? But staying engaged is really great, and we certainly encourage and we'll offer our ongoing help to say, if this is something that people in this room are like, I don't want this to be the last time we talk about this, I want to come back to this, how can we have more meetings about this, where are those touch points? Then we're happy to help kind of continue to talk about that and how other communities have grappled with that. And we're just generally available as well. And then policy and advocacy should not be, I don't want to just gloss over this one, right? We talked about this really bad PSLF rule that sort of weaponizes the program. Huge hundreds and hundreds of organizations signed on to letters opposing that. Individual borrowers signed on to letters opposing that. And we had a letter from local elected officials. We had 33 mayors, council members, county attorneys, city attorneys, et cetera, sign on this letter. Very important ways to raise your voice at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. And you know, being a storyteller, I guess, is where I would end, is also a really important local level. If you're like, I don't know about all this other stuff, but we work with a lot of people who are in this position, ask them what's going on. If they've got some really compelling stories, make sure it's captured. Share that with people. See if local radio and media are interested in understanding what people are going through, or work with organizations like ours to help amplify. Okay, we made it. I hope I didn't take up too much time.
All right. So yeah, we'd love to take some questions first. You know, what are you thinking? What do you have questions on? What wasn't clear? Yeah.
For the RAP program, the AGI, is that for household or individual? And is there going to be a difference between joint and single family?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't want to get the minutia of it wrong. I'm fairly certain that it's household at AGI, which was the case in prior IBR plans, right? So it takes into account the household. But there may be an option in the new RAP plan to separate that out. If, for example, you don't make much money and your spouse does, there may be a way to kind of equalize that to get a better deal. But we can follow up and get you the like 100% right answer.
Great question. Yeah.
For those resources like Summer or Savvy, are there spaces where individuals can access those low costs, or is that something that's more like an institutional or organizational benefit?
Yeah, another good question. They definitely want people to come and use their service, but you have to pay for it. So we like it more when it's offered as sort of an employee benefit, and your employer is taking on that cost, so you don't, individual struggling borrowers don't have to. But you absolutely, I couldn't cite what they charge off the top of my head, but you can absolutely use those tools.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. It's from a class of 30 students. When they came to know that I'm going to be attending this conference, well, we had this overall sentiment that why don't the education institutions take a lead in advocating for like student loans and in terms of like educating them in general. Like this is a common widespread issue. Why don't we create a curriculum or a course that can be part of an elective? It can be a basic financial literacy course. It can cover these topics along with that about how do investments work, how do interest works, and how do you not fall into the trap of this right here.
Yeah, this comes up a lot, especially like not just at the university level, but also at the high school level. I feel like financial literacy comes up a lot because, I don't know, that was not part of my education at least.
Yeah.
And it seems really useful, you know, to know like your own finances, how they work. So, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I think that would be something that would be a great point of advocacy for current students, or folks that are currently attending universities. I don't know if you have other thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of different thoughts. One is that I think it's great for students to speak truth to the local power, to talk to their own administration about these concerns. I have generally gotten the sense that higher ed has wanted to stay out of the spotlight and for obvious reasons, out of the spotlight and on the sidelines through a lot of these battles over what's happening with student loans and student loan repayment. And I think they're going too far in avoiding kind of speaking up about these being real issues for the current students, for the alumni, for people who didn't complete So that's one, is I think I encourage your class to continue to ask that locally. And then at the high school level is something that I've seen, most localities have a vested policy interest in post-secondary access and success. I mean, something mayors talk about, it's something everybody wants to, has been part of the American dream, right? Economic mobility, you're getting that degree. But there's, again, this huge gap in preparedness or awareness, especially about how am I going to pay for it. So if you want to get an example of a handful of organizations that are trying to, from a nonprofit sense, be helpful there, U Aspire, the letter U and then ASPIRE, is an organization that is trying to work, starting when you're in high school and through college, to work on college affordability counseling and understanding that landscape. And so there are some examples, and I'm hopeful that cities and school districts will kind of pick that up. It's really hard to have, like, in San Francisco, we would go to the school district, and one day there'd be an answer saying, well, our school counselors do that, so we're set, no worries. But if you get the school counselors in the room, they're like, we've got 500 students or more per counselor, and no real training other than some mimeograph, and I choose mimeograph because I swear that this was what the era we were talking about, these binders that they would pull out, and dust on top of them. This is what they give us, all these students, how are we going to be expected? So I do think there's a huge gap in people getting the help before they get to college and when they get in. I think it's a great question.
Yeah, and I think there's like a lot to be said for financial literacy. Like it's certainly something that was a gap in my education that I could use more of. But I think also, like, the numbers are what they are, and in some cases, like, the rising cost of education, just the math problem doesn't work out, right? Like, there's no amount of financial literacy that could help you in some of these cases, like, if you just can't meet the costs of education and you have to borrow, right? And so, like, sometimes when we're talking with borrowers, like, the first question we'll ask folks is, like, is this a debt that you can pay off, like, you can actually pay it off, or will you need a cancellation program to, like, get rid of this debt because you have, like, $100,000 in student debt and there's just no way that you could pay it off. And so, I think, like, a lot of organizations in this movement are, like, really moving towards free college and figuring out what free college looks like. And, this is kind of like what we're doing in the interim, right? Like, we're just trying to, like, kind of help people as much as we can in the meantime until we have free college, right? Any other questions? Yeah.
I'll let if anyone else has one, put them in. I was interested in the beginning, you showed the projections of mortgages being still the highest, correct, and then student loans being the second. Do you anticipate that switching with the fact that student loans are preventing folks from being able to buy homes?
I don't know that I would see, I'd have to remember what mortgages look like. Given the size of mortgages, student loans are getting more expensive, but mortgages are going to stay. Houses are getting more expensive too. Yeah. So given the size of borrowing in that sector, I think that's going to stay number one. But if I might take that question and take it to another, we talked about the pressures of student debt on people's household budgets. It's not just student debt, obviously. It's what credit card debt you hold and what other forms of payments that you are obligated to make, plus your housing, your child care, your health care, all of these big. And something that Protect Borrowers, now with the shift to a broader focus on household debt, really wants to look at is how does that all come together to make a bigger picture. So as you're looking for someone who has not been in repayment on student loan debts in a while, and they're going to start making those payments, the buckets of debts that you owe on look very different now than they did 10 years ago, and they include buy now, pay later loans, which people are using for groceries these days, and at fast food restaurants, and literally anywhere you can be. And a lot of that debt is taken out to repay other debt. And so there's a real cascade effect that is broadly concerning. I think if you want to check out our website and our latest press releases, there's one from maybe yesterday talking about these findings because the New York Federal Reserve just came out with their latest report on the state of household debt, and it's as bad as it's been since at least the Great Recession. And I think one of the quotes in there that was fascinating to me is you're starting to get companies like Chipotle, and I forget the other examples, say we are seeing the impact of student loan debt on our corporate sales. People have less expendable income to come and buy from us because of these other pressures.
I I can also do more research, because I think it's a really good question, and maybe there is some more research out there on like that kind of line, because I think that's, yeah, great question.
Just if people are moving to renting instead, right?
Right.
Like it's a different.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry I came super late. My name is Hulda Mumani-Hiltsley, and welcome to Senate District 38A. I get the privilege of representing this district at the state capitol. And so I'm so excited to have you guys come here. I feel like we need a PhD in what you guys are doing, because this is a lot. And as someone who came here as a family, immigrant family who came here, and we didn't have the luxury of my parents having, funding for education. The only option that I had was student loans. So I went to a private university, right? Did my undergrad there, did my master's there, and I have all this student, loan debt. And, luckily enough, I have been fortunate enough to somehow, some way, be able to afford, buying a home. But I am seeing how that debt is literally crippling families, not only physically, but mentally, right? And so it's not just having a debt, it's everything that comes with that. And so I'm super excited to have you guys in the state of Minnesota, with the key stakeholders around, the Lead Minnesota Student United. And it's going to take all of us to address this, because it's not going to get any better. And so I'm so excited to be a part of a state that is pushing policies that are really addressing, root core challenges and concerns that real people have. But the most frustrating thing for me is that there is help out there. An average citizen just don't know what to do about it. And so having sessions like this is so important for communities. And we talk about, I really appreciated this young man's, idea of integrating a course within our institutions. But it's the community also that needs that, outside of our institutions. It's our parents, it's who are on the hook for some of these parent loans, right? Who have no idea what to do next.
Yeah.
And so, for me, I'm curious to know, as progressive as Minnesota is, what additional work can we do from the legislative side that we can partner with organizations like you guys, especially, for example, going into the policy year next year, right? What does that look like, and how do we come together as this collective, stakeholders to push some of this legislative pieces that can bring some sort of relief to the community and to the state of Minnesota in general. And then also, I was thinking about the new generation that is coming up, and we talked about that, and I'm so glad that you guys, mentioned something about how, so let's start thinking about long-term sustainability of our communities, and that's free education. And that's where I'm like, a lot of the students, or a lot of, folks are not looking at a 4-year, 2-year, 4-year, track. They're looking at a trade. So that's a part of that conversation, long-term conversation, in regards to how do we create a sustainable community without having all of these debts. So I just really wanted to appreciate you guys coming out here. And this should have been in an auditorium, because many of us are even afraid to even talk about it because of the anxiety, because of just all of this weight of this debt. Some of us don't even want to, even look. I think you talked about some people have not even looked for years. And without even looking, and without even doing anything, the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. And so I just want to thank all of you guys for showing up, because this is important. This is how we're going to change the trajectory of our communities and our families to allow us to even breathe. Because right now with my student loans, I am over here just mentally just exhausted with everything, especially with what's going on with the current administration, not making it any easier for our communities. So I really appreciate that you guys were here today.
Well, thank you for coming. It's such an honor to have you here. And if you're looking for a to-do list, I might just direct your eyes to this slide here. So again, Minnesota has this one, and also the ending transcript and diploma withholding. But there's, 3 other things on this list, and I'm sure we could come up with more ideas if you need them. And we'll be sharing this slide deck out afterwards too. But yeah.
And I would come back just tangibly to, I mentioned for this gap of direct assistance, where can I talk to somebody about this problem? That a couple of states, so Unsurprisingly, New York State and California State are the two examples right now. New York State has a program called EdCap that provides a certain amount of state funding to a nonprofit that then does all of the training, operates a hotline, really, really sharp folks. And so anyone in New York State, right, can theoretically have a place to go, a dedicated website, a hotline to get that help. In California, it was their Department of Financial Protection and Innovation that, after a lot of years of pressure by advocates, allocated some money to a very similar idea. National Consumer Law Center is helping to do some of the training. There are nonprofits throughout the state. I think there's a Bay Area organization that operates a hotline, and they're supported in this, and we're hoping that they re-up that. In California, we're talking about $5 to $7 million, which sounds like a lot, but think about the size of California here. And so you could take that number down quite a bit and have the state really of Minnesota think about ways to support the training and the work that is done by Lutheran social services or by potential city programs or others. So another tangible plug for a little bit of funding that would really go a long way.
No, I appreciate it. That's one of the things that I wrote down. Investing in resources towards educating our community around what's out there, what's possible. And so I would be curious to connect with some of these key stakeholders who are passionate about this topic and kind of figuring out from the state level, what does funding look like to have the tools to go out into communities, not just institutions. I'm talking about, churches. I'm talking about community events. I'm talking about all of these different areas where, people are congregating and really educate. I think that's the biggest gap. The fact that a lot of people don't know that this information is out there, or they're afraid to seek because they just don't want to deal with it mentally. But if we can get individuals like yourselves and other key stakeholders to come out here and really, let folks know that, hey, there is help out here. It's just a matter of taking that first step, and we are here to hold your hand towards that. I think that can go a long way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Folks have other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Well, and we're doing a poor job of not bringing you up to, and also not acknowledging St. Paul Council member Molly Coleman, who's also here. Thank you for giving us some of your time. It's an important issue. So glad to see local electeds and state electeds really paying attention. Thank you.
Folks have, yeah.
I just have a small plug for something that we're doing at Students United, which is that we advocate for the full expansion of the direct admissions program in Minnesota for the pretty much not an only purpose, but we want to make sure that every student knows about North Star Promise. And so to your point about access and letting students know, I think like a big part of our push right now is when a student is in high school and they are starting to think about college or think about a 2-year or think about anything, they should have something in front of them that says, you are automatically, based on what we know about your grades, here are the schools you're automatically admitted to, and also here's the program North Star Promise for you, and also here's that's one piece of paper, which a lot of people will say, it's just a piece of paper, it can't really do much. But actually it's, I think, the most important thing that we can do to build on the infrastructure of the North Star Promise, and to make sure that every K-12 student knows about the resources that they have as a Minnesotan. So.
If there are no more questions, are there things that resonated here that you're seeing in your work? And if you want to just, take a moment to introduce yourself and kind of say maybe what you've been seeing. Yeah.
I have a small question about something related to these. You talked about the PSLF multiplier.
Yeah.
Is that in state statute in those states? Or is that more of a contract negotiation thing?
Oh.
I'm thinking about our unions.
Yeah, that's a great question. In some states, it's state statute, and then some states have done union things. So it's been in union contract. It's been both ways, but mostly I'm thinking about state statutes here. Yeah.
Which one was easiest to move in, or which one was? I'm asking a question that's probably complicated, but which one felt most feasible?
I think it depends on how strong the unions are in the state, right? But I think the PSLF bills have not had a ton of pushback. It's been a relatively easy ride in most of the states where we've done them, because you're just kind of notifying you're notifying your employees that they're eligible for PSLF. You're mandated to sign their forms, which a lot of folks have had problems where their employers won't sign forms for them, and then doing this multiplier thing that doesn't really affect like, it's not a financial bill, right? So like there's, you know, there hasn't really been a ton of pushback on those across states, which is cool. Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments, thoughts? Yeah.
Just one other thing that we've been, or that I've seen in my work, is that the work that isn't covered by PSLF, so like 501c5. So just thinking about unions, if you work for a union, then you are eligible for public service forgiveness, and the ways in which, even prior to the legislation from the summer that should not be needed, the ways in which our PSLF system was cutting out really critical work.
Yep.
Because it was within power for working people,
Yep.
is I think a long-term trend that we should be aware of.
Yeah, that's a great flag. Thank you for mentioning that. I worked for a union for 3.5 years, and that time does not count towards PSLF, and it kills me. But yeah, that's a great flag.
Can I throw one sort of silly plug? I'm on some other national call with partners, and they call the big beautiful bill, they just call it HR1.
Yeah.
That's an easier way for people to talk about it that doesn't use the word beautiful.
Yeah.
Love that.
Thank you. Okay. Any other thoughts, feelings, gripes, complaints?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all so much for joining. Please stick around and say hi. Have some more food. Have some mugs.